How do you turn a footstep into a weapon? How do you build the most feared fighting unit in an entire theater of war out of silence, patience, and 11 dogs purchased from a Sydney pound for $3 each? The Viet Cong gave them a name that had no equivalent in any military manual ever written. They called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. Not because of their firepower, not because of their technology, because they could not be found, could not be heard, and could not be predicted, and because the men they hunted had no defense against a predator that had learned to become the environment itself. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, what do you think is the most underrated weapon ever used in warfare? Because what you are about to discover will change how you answer that question. Stay until the end, because the final chapter of this story, the one the Army buried, the one that had to be rediscovered at enormous cost in different deserts a generation later, is the one that still matters today. The disaster begins, as most military disasters do, not with a single catastrophic decision, but with a philosophy applied to the wrong problem with absolute confidence. By 1966, the United States had committed 500,000 soldiers to South Vietnam. The American military machine that had arrived in Southeast Asia was the most expensive, most technologically sophisticated fighting force in human history. Its doctrine rested on 3 unshakable foundations: overwhelming firepower, maximum mobility through helicopters, and the absolute supremacy of technology over terrain. When a patrol made contact with the enemy, the procedure was clear: withdraw to a safe distance, call in air support, incinerate the grid square. The system had been refined through countless training exercises and approved by the finest military minds the country could produce. It had been tested in Korea against regular armies fighting along established front lines. It had been war-gamed across multiple continents. The generals in Washington were certain it would work here. It was not working here. The specific, humiliating problem was this: the Viet Cong simply could not be found. They moved through the triple canopy jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, a dense, suffocating territory 50 miles east of Saigon, where sunlight barely reached the ground, and visibility in some areas was limited to 20 yards, leaving almost no trace. They struck, and they vanished. American patrols, loaded with 40 to 50 kilograms of equipment, crashed through undergrowth, announcing their presence to anyone within earshot. Thermal imagers costing thousands of dollars per unit failed completely in the field. Motion sensors dropped from helicopters by the hundreds proved useless against an enemy that moved at its own pace through terrain it had mastered over decades. Chemical detectors designed to identify human presence through smell registered the ambient biology of the jungle and nothing else. Every piece of technology the American military could deploy had been defeated by the environment, and by an enemy that had spent 20 years learning to use that environment as armor. The Americans threw more of everything at the problem: more airstrikes, more artillery, more helicopters, more sensors. The body count became the measure of success, the daily tally that generals in Washington used to convince themselves the war of attrition was being won. They called in napalm on grid squares, where the enemy had been seen minutes before. They bombed ridgelines that intelligence suggested might contain supply routes. They defoliated entire provinces with chemical agents to strip away the jungle canopy and expose the forces beneath. Every escalation produced the same result. The enemy adapted, absorbed the punishment, and continued operating. You could not count what you could not find. And in Phuoc Tuy Province, the enemy had been invisible for years. The Viet Cong commanders operating in Phuoc Tuy had developed their own doctrine for defeating American firepower, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. When the Americans opened fire, the Viet Cong fighters would not retreat. They would charge. They would close the distance to 20 meters, then 15, then 10, effectively hugging the American lines so tightly that calling in air support meant eliminating their own troops. At this range, technology meant nothing. Numerical superiority determined who survived. The Vietnamese had turned the American advantage into a liability with devastating efficiency. They had studied their enemy, identified the fatal dependency on air support, and exploited it with ruthless discipline. By 1967, the casualty rate for American units in close contact engagements had risen sharply compared to previous years. American commanders were trapped, unable to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight a conventional war and refused to remain visible long enough to be destroyed. Now, it was into this situation that General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, turned his attention to the Australians, and what he found infuriated him. In early 1967, Westmoreland formally complained to Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. He put his assessment in writing. The Australians were, he noted, very inactive. Out of a task force of 4,600 troops, they put only 6 rifle companies in the field. He was concerned at what he saw as the lack of combat power being developed and the small results achieved for the size of the Australian investment. He explained to Vincent, in all fairness to the command and to their reputation, this observation should be known. He was genuinely alarmed by a statistic that journalists covering the Australian sector had already documented. Australian patrols were taking as many as 9 hours to sweep a single mile of terrain. One correspondent described accompanying an Australian patrol as frustrating. The men moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, then proceeded again. To Westmoreland's eye, trained by decades of conventional military doctrine, this looked like timidity. It looked like a waste of resources. It looked like failure. The man who would oversee the most expensive military failure in American history had looked at the most effective counterinsurgency force in the theater and called them inactive. That gap between what Westmoreland measured and what the Australians understood is the entire story. The Americans were measuring success by ground covered per day. The Australians were measuring success by whether the enemy could move at all. They were playing entirely different games, and only one of those games was the right one for the war they were actually fighting. The answer to why the Australians thought so differently about jungle warfare does not begin in Vietnam. It begins more than a decade earlier, in the suffocating heat of Malaya, where a different army had already confronted the same impossible problem and found a solution that would eventually travel halfway around the world to reach the jungles of Phuoc Tuy. The British-Malayan emergency lasted from 1948 to 1960 and was, at its core, a war fought in dense jungle against a communist insurgency that had mastered the art of disappearing. The British discovered what the Americans would later refuse to accept: the technology was not the answer, and that the jungle itself, the silence, the biological information embedded in every footprint and broken twig and disturbed patch of moss, was the primary source of intelligence in a guerrilla war. Conventional forces using conventional methods were consistently outmaneuvered by small enemy units that knew the terrain and used it deliberately as a weapon. The British recognized this not as a tactical problem, but as a philosophical one. Their entire framework for understanding warfare had to change before their tactics could change. It took years, it cost lives, and eventually it produced one of the most effective counterinsurgency tools ever developed. They built combat tracker teams. Each team consisted of a visual tracker who could read the language of disturbed Earth, a dog handler with a Labrador Retriever trained to follow a single human scent across kilometers of jungle floor, a coverman whose sole responsibility was protecting the tracker while he worked, a signaler to maintain communication with supporting forces, and a team leader to manage the tactical picture and make contact decisions. 5 people, moving fast enough to pursue a retreating enemy, small enough to enter terrain that larger formations could not navigate without announcing themselves. The British had figured out how to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. These lessons were tested and refined further in the jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966, where Australian Special Forces units operated alongside the British and absorbed not only the techniques, but the underlying philosophy. In that kind of war, patience was not a virtue, it was the primary weapon. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had been formed in 1957, modeled on the British SAS and carrying its motto, "Who dares wins." The regiment first saw active service in Borneo, where its soldiers learned something no training manual could provide, what it felt like to live in the jungle for weeks without resupply, moving at the pace the environment demanded rather than the pace military doctrine preferred. In Borneo, the Australian SAS conducted secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory, patrols that demanded absolute silence and absolute discipline, because discovery meant not just death, but an international incident. The soldiers who survived those operations came back, changed. They had been reshaped by the jungle from the inside out. They had learned that silence was not simply the absence of noise. It was a discipline, a skill, a philosophy that had to be practiced until it became instinct. When these men arrived in Vietnam, they carried that instinct with them. It shaped everything that followed. The tracker dog program that accompanied this philosophy into Vietnam had an origin story that was, by any measure, improbable. In 1966, the Australian Army's tracking wing was formally established at the School of Infantry in Ingleburn, New South Wales. Staff needed dogs. The solution was characteristically pragmatic. They went to the local pound. Between $2 and $3 per animal, they acquired 11 Labrador Retrievers, who would form the nucleus of the most effective intelligence-gathering system Australia would deploy in the entire war. With an instinct for grandeur that their modest origin made all the more remarkable, each dog was given the name of a Roman emperor: Tiber, Julian, Janus, Marcus, Cassius, Justin, Caesar, Milo, Trajan, Juno, and Marcion. 11 animals rescued from death row, purchased for pocket change from a Sydney shelter, who would become the most consequential intelligence asset in a province that the Viet Cong had controlled for years. The training program that followed lasted 10 months and was designed to produce animals capable of tracking a single human scent trail more than 16 kilometers long, more than 24 hours old, through terrain that would defeat any mechanical sensor ever built. The process began with basic obedience and the deliberate construction of the bond between handler and dog, because in the field that bond was not an emotional luxury. It was the operational foundation on which everything else rested. Morning routines started with runs through the surrounding countryside to harden the dog's paws and build their endurance. They were desensitized to gunfire, to explosions, to the roar of helicopter rotors, to every form of sensory chaos the jungle could offer. They trained hanging above the jungle canopy in rescue harnesses, so they would not panic during airborne insertion into areas where no landing zone existed. They were trained using South Vietnamese soldiers as decoys, deliberately, so they would learn to distinguish the specific biological scent profile of a body shaped by a lifetime of rice, fish, and the particular bacterial flora that diet produces on human skin. By the program's 5th month, formal military tracking had begun. Leashed in harnesses, the dogs searched through simulated enemy positions, learning to isolate a single target odor from the overwhelming complexity of the jungle's biological noise. A dog can detect a scent that a human nose would never register, following a trail composed of microscopic particles of skin, sweat, and the specific chemical signature of an individual body, across any surface, through any weather, across distances that strain belief. There is currently nothing in existence, as one Australian Army specialist would later write, that can replicate the ability of a tracking dog to isolate a single human odor, follow it for many kilometers, and provide early warning when approaching the threat. In May of 1967, the first 2 tracker dogs arrived in South Vietnam. Caesar, the Labrador Kelpie cross, the one whose handler Peter Haran would later describe as a larrikin and a smart arse, the one whose survival in a war zone, Haran said, depended on a wet nose and the uncanny animal instinct of a dog that cost $3, stepped off a transport aircraft into the heat of Phuoc Tuy Province. Alongside him came Marcus, a purebred black Labrador, gentle in nature and, according to those who worked with him, possessed of a heart that would never quit. Marcus was described by one of his handlers as a very fine tracker dog with a big heart and a very gentle nature who would never give up. When the officers watching them land considered what they were looking at, most had no idea they were observing the most consequential intelligence-gathering system the Australians would deploy in the entire war. They saw 2 dogs stepping off an airplane. They did not see what those dogs represented: the distillation of 40,000 years of human tracking knowledge, refined through decades of British and Australian jungle warfare experience, and now arriving in a province where every other intelligence-gathering method had already failed. And the dogs were one component of the weapon being assembled. The other, the one that had no price tag and could not be purchased from any pound or procured from any defense contractor, was what happened when a 5-man SAS patrol entered the jungle and became, for all practical purposes, invisible. Grasping how the Australians achieved this invisibility requires accepting something that is counterintuitive to every instinct military training cultivates: that the most dangerous thing a soldier can do in a jungle is move quickly. Speed creates noise. Noise creates detection. Detection, in a jungle where the enemy knows the terrain and the invader does not, creates death. The Australians had absorbed this truth so completely that it had ceased to be doctrine and had become reflex, and small patrols of 4 to 6 men moved more slowly than any other unit in Vietnam, including other special operations forces. They covered perhaps 2 to 3 kilometers in a full day of movement. Every 15 to 20 minutes of forward progress was followed by an hour of absolute stillness, lying motionless in the undergrowth, listening to the breathing of the forest, waiting for the ambient sounds of birds and insects to resume their normal patterns around them. When the sounds resumed, the patrol was safe to move again. When the sound stopped, something was close. The jungle was always talking. The Australians had learned to listen. The equipment modifications that enabled this silence were the work of men who had cataloged every possible source of sound and eliminated it with the thoroughness of engineers solving a technical problem. The standard L1A1 self-loading rifle was stripped of everything non-essential. Carrying handles were sawed off. Flash suppressors were removed from barrels. Sling swivels, the small metal rings that attach a rifle's carrying strap, were replaced with paracord that made no sound when it brushed against cloth or vegetation. Metal canteens were replaced with soft plastic water bladders that neither clinked against equipment nor sloshed audibly with movement. Metal buckles on webbing and load-carrying equipment were replaced with rope and paracord ties. Dog tags were taped flat against the chest so they could not move. The distinctive sweat scarf unique to Australian and New Zealand forces, a length of cloth with no metal fittings of any kind, was worn around the neck, serving simultaneously as camouflage and as one more surface from which every possible source of sound had been deliberately removed. Even the boots were modified. Some operators cut slits in the sides to allow water to drain instantly rather than accumulating inside, because a waterlogged boot makes a distinct sucking sound with each step that can be heard from meters away. Every modification was made with a single governing principle: remove anything that could speak before the patrol chose to speak. An American patrol, equipped by standard doctrine, produced a symphony of small sounds that an experienced Viet Cong sentry could identify from 150 meters. The buckle scraping against the rifle stock, the rhythmic swish of nylon trousers moving against each other with each step, the heavy thud of leather combat boots on packed earth, the rattle of a half-empty magazine in its canvas pouch, the metallic click of a canteen cap bouncing against the canteen body, the rustle of a nylon pack rubbing against a uniform with each shift of weight. Each sound alone was small, barely noticeable in isolation. Together, they composed a signal that was unmistakable and continuous, announcing a foreign presence to anyone whose training had taught them to listen for it. The Australians had removed every note from that composition. They moved in silence because they had physically stripped from their bodies everything that declared a foreign presence in the jungle, everything that said, in the language of sound, that someone who did not belong had arrived. When this silence was broken, the reversal was designed to be total and overwhelming. A 5-man SAS patrol, when compromised and forced into contact, did not fight like 5 men. It fought like a company. The rate and volume of fire was trained specifically to simulate a far larger force, every man firing as rapidly and continuously as possible, while moving through pre-planned contact drills designed to create maximum confusion and noise in minimum time. Some Australians even converted their rifles to produce sounds that mimicked heavy machine guns. The slow, silent approach followed by the sudden, overwhelming violence of contact made the Australians the most feared unit in the regions of South Vietnam they operated in. The enemy had no framework for what they were encountering, no way to reconcile the total absence of warning with the devastating firepower that replaced it in an instant. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden, who had attended Army Ranger School, Raider School, and multiple other specialized training programs, later said he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australians than he had learned anywhere else in the world. In UDT, you just didn't have the fieldcraft to be out in the jungle looking for people, he said. Their fieldcraft was so good. He noted that they lost a lot of SEALs because of insufficient fieldcraft preparation. Operators, who had taken over from those they replaced the very same day they arrived in country, so flying straight into combat environments with no understanding of what the jungle demanded of a human body and a human mind. The Australians, by contrast, had been shaped by a doctrine that treated the jungle as the primary tactical reality to which everything else had to adapt. One Australian officer summarized the entire philosophy in 8 words. "Under our system," he said, "we do the lurking. Not a tactic. A declaration of war against the assumption that speed and firepower were the primary instruments of military power." The visual tracker who accompanied each patrol worked in a different register from the dog, but was no less essential to the system's effectiveness. Where the dog followed scent, invisible, aerial, molecular, composing its picture of the world from information that no human sense could detect, the visual tracker read the physical language of the earth in a way that complemented everything the dog could not interpret. A well-experienced visual tracker could determine the number of people who had passed through an area from the number and distribution of footprints. He could assess the direction and pace of their movement from the angle and depth of impressions in soft ground. He could identify whether any were carrying heavy loads from the way weight distribution altered the shape of a footprint. He could determine whether anyone was injured from subtle irregularities in stride pattern and foot placement. With experience refined over years, he could even identify the sex of individuals making the tracks and estimate the types of weapons they were carrying from the way specific loads affected movement. American trackers trained by Australians described developing what one called a sixth sense, utilizing methods that Native American scouts had employed for centuries, looking for broken twigs, turned-over leaves, rocks displaced from their natural orientation by the passage of weight, spiderwebs disturbed and partially rebuilt, moisture patterns in soil that revealed how recently water had been pressed from the ground by a foot. The earth was a document. The visual tracker had learned to read it. The combination of dog and visual tracker was more powerful than either element alone, and this was the insight that made the Australian system genuinely irreplaceable. The dog moved faster than any human tracker and could follow a scent that the human eye would never detect, trailing a quarry across bare rock, through streams, over ground that showed no physical sign of passage. The visual tracker provided context that the dog could not offer: interpretation, enumeration, tactical assessment. When the dog indicated that someone had been in an area, the visual tracker could tell the commander how many people, how recently, in what direction, carrying what, and in what physical condition. The dog found the thread. The visual tracker read the story it was telling. Together, they constituted a system that the Viet Cong, who had mastered every technique for defeating American technology, had no answer for. They had learned to fool thermal sensors by covering themselves in mud that matched their body temperature. They had developed extensive tunnel systems to appear and disappear beneath the surface of the jungle floor. They had learned to move at agonizing slowness to evade motion detectors. They had studied the patterns of American aerial surveillance and moved only when coverage gaps allowed. None of these techniques defeated a Labrador Retriever following a scent trail that was 16 hours old, still perfectly legible to a nose of sufficient sensitivity, through jungle that concealed an entire army from everything else that searched for it. The dog did not use technology. It used biology, and the Viet Cong had no countermeasure for biology. In November of 1967, a tracker dog named Justin located a group of Viet Cong during Operation Santa Fe in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy Province. The tracker team following Justin's lead found the enemy approximately 30 yards ahead of their position. The team opened fire and inflicted 2 fatal casualties. The exchange lasted seconds. Its significance lay not in those casualties, but in what it demonstrated so cleanly. The tracker teams could locate in hours what American technology had failed to locate in months. The intelligence they extracted from each mission, exact coordinates of hidden positions, the layout of supply routes, and the timing of their use, movement patterns that revealed the enemy's operational rhythms, even the morale condition of enemy units deduced from the condition and organization of their encampments, was of a quality that no aerial photograph or intercepted radio transmission could approach. The tracker teams were not just finding the enemy. They were reading the enemy, building a picture of how the Viet Cong thought and moved and planned that made every subsequent operation more precise and more effective. Marcus, the second of the 2 original dogs deployed to Vietnam, served 5 handlers across 4 years of continuous operational service. His first handler, Dennis Ferguson, completed his 13-month deployment in 1968 and prepared to return to Australia. Ferguson was then required, under the operational necessity of maintaining the dog's effectiveness, to completely ignore Marcus, to refuse to acknowledge his existence, so the dog would immediately begin bonding with his new handler. The requirement was brutal in its logic. The bond between a tracker and his dog was not a sentiment to be indulged. It was the operational foundation of the entire system. A dog that continued to look to a departed handler for leadership could not give its full attention and trust to a new one. And a dog that did not fully trust its handler was not a tracking dog. It was a liability. And so Ferguson, who had trusted Marcus with his life for 13 months, who had walked within meters of the enemy, with no more warning system than the subtle shift in a dog's body language, who had shared the particular intimacy of two beings operating together in constant danger, was required to walk past him as though he did not exist. Marcus watched his handler leave and could not have understood why. He served Alvin Peterson after Ferguson, then William Wright and Wayne Dixon, then Ferguson again briefly before Sean Dobson took him through the final months of Australian involvement. He kept working through every transition, rebuilding trust with each new handler from zero, never refusing the work, never faltering in the field. He would serve in Vietnam for the entire duration of Australian involvement, longer than any human soldier who rotated through the province. He would never come home. Now consider what this capability produced in practice, not as doctrine written in manuals, but as lived experience, the accumulated reality of more than 1,000 patrols distilled into the representative mission that any of those men would recognize as their own. The briefing lasted 11 minutes. A 5-man SAS patrol received its orders at the Nui Dat base camp on the red laterite hill that the regiment had made its home. The mission: locate enemy activity in the target sector, gather actionable intelligence on movement patterns and supply infrastructure, transmit coordinates, extract. Duration: 10 days. There would be no gunship cover during the approach phase, no artillery pre-registered on grid squares along their route, no quick reaction force positioned within rapid response distance. The extraction point was chosen deliberately 20 kilometers from where the patrol would be inserted, so that no one connecting the sound of a helicopter landing to their eventual operating area could compromise the mission before it began. An American commander, mounting a comparable intelligence-gathering operation, would have sent 30 to 40 men with helicopter gunships flying cover, a pre-planned extraction protocol designed to have everyone out of the jungle within 8 hours, and enough firepower to fight their way out if compromised. The Australian plan was 5 men, 10 days, and silence. The American approach assumed that speed and firepower would compensate for visibility. The Australian approach assumed that if you were visible, you were already in trouble. The insertion technique they used had been developed and refined over years of operational experience, after the Viet Cong had become sophisticated enough to recognize SAS landing patterns and sometimes opened fire on patrols within minutes of a helicopter departing. 2 aircraft. The helicopter carrying the patrol flew at treetop height, guided from above by a command aircraft tracking the route and monitoring the landing zone. A second helicopter flew the same route immediately behind the first. As the patrol's aircraft touched down at the jungle's edge and the men stepped off into the vegetation, the second helicopter flew directly overhead at the same moment, its engine noise masking the sound of the first aircraft landing. The patrol's aircraft lifted immediately. Both machines circled briefly to maintain the impression of ongoing activity. Then they departed together. Anyone watching from the tree line had seen 2 helicopters come and go. They had seen nothing land and nothing leave on foot. 5 men had dissolved into the vegetation and left no evidence of arrival. They did not speak. From the moment the helicopters departed, for the next 10 days, communication would be conducted through hand signals developed and refined over years of shared operational experience, none through the absolute stillness of bodies held motionless in the undergrowth at any sign of threat, and through 2 brief bursts of coded static transmitted every 24 hours on the radio, enough to confirm that the patrol was alive and on schedule, insufficient in duration to be direction found by enemy signals intelligence units tracking radio transmissions. The jungle they were entering held more than 1,000 enemy fighters. 5 men were about to spend 10 days moving through that jungle without being detected. 3 kilometers per day at the outer limit. 15 minutes of movement, each footstep placed with deliberate intention, foot touching ground before weight committed, branches held aside with a hand and released behind rather than pushed through and allowed to spring back with sound, followed by an hour of absolute stillness. During the stillness, they listened. The sounds of the jungle carry information that experienced operators learn to read with the same attentiveness a sailor gives to the color of the sky and the feel of the wind on his face. Birds call in patterns that reflect the movements of large animals, and their calls change when something unusual moves through a space below them. Insects maintain a constant background register that falls silent when disturbed, and the silence spreads outward from the disturbance in a wave that an attentive patrol can track like a compass bearing. When the birds went quiet ahead of them, the patrol stopped and waited, sometimes for 2 full hours, until the forest gradually resumed its normal patterns and confirmed that whatever had disturbed it had passed or moved away. At night, they went to ground in positions that were as much constructed as discovered. Natural depressions deepened slightly and covered with vegetation collected from the immediately surrounding area, camouflaged so completely that a man walking within 5 meters would pass without awareness of what lay beneath the leaves at his feet. On the 4th day, the tracker stopped. The tracks were no more than 6 hours old. He moved slowly along the impressions left in a narrow strip of lower, softer ground between 2 ridgelines, reading each print with a concentration so complete that it excluded every peripheral distraction and reduced the entire world to the information contained in the disturbed earth at his feet. The depth of the heel impression told him weight. The distance between successive prints told him pace and confirmed the presence of multiple individuals. The slight inward roll on one set of prints told him about load distribution, someone carrying something heavy enough to shift their center of gravity and alter the natural mechanics of their stride. He counted the sets of prints. He noted the direction. He noted a detail in one set that spoke of an individual favoring one leg slightly, a subtle irregularity in the pattern that suggested either an old injury or a fresh one. He communicated everything he knew through the precise economy of a hand signal, and the patrol adjusted its course. The dog had already known. 2 full minutes before the tracker found the first footprint, the Labrador's posture had shifted in a way that the handler recognized immediately and completely. Or ears forward, nose working in a pattern that had nothing to do with the ambient smells of the jungle floor and everything to do with a specific human odor that no one else in the patrol could detect. The alert was subtle, biological, expressed in the slight stiffening of muscles along the back and the shoulders, and in the increased urgency of the movement of the nose as it worked back and forth across a scent cone that only it could perceive. The handler read it the way all information in the jungle is read, by those who have learned to pay attention. Not as a discrete event with a clear announcement, but as a shift in the accumulated signal of the environment. Something was ahead. The gap between the patrol and that something was narrowing with every step. They followed for 2 days. On the 6th afternoon, the dog's posture changed again, and this time, the change was different from anything the tracking alert produced. It was different from the comfortable, purposeful momentum of a nose working along a known trail toward a distant source. The stiffening was more complete. The head came up slightly. The movement of the body became almost imperceptible, as though the dog was trying to reduce the sound of its own breathing. The handler had seen this specific shift before, in training and in the field, and he understood immediately what it meant. It did not mean the trail was getting stronger. It meant proximity. The source of the scent was not 20 meters ahead on a continuing trail. It was very close, possibly off the trail, possibly in the undergrowth around them. The patrol went motionless. None the Viet Cong scout materialized from the vegetation perhaps 4 meters away. He moved with the unhurried, methodical caution of a professional who trusted his senses completely, his head turning in a slow, systematic scan that covered every sector of his field of vision. He stopped. He stood close enough that the patrol members could see individual details of his equipment with absolute clarity, could count the magazines arranged in his chest rig, could see the sweat on his face and the patience in his posture. He was not hurrying. He was checking. He had been moving through this jungle long enough that his instincts were reliable, and his instincts had told him to pause here and confirm what his eyes and ears were telling him. He stood there for a period of time that every man watching him experienced as much longer than it actually was. Then he flared his nostrils and breathed in slowly through his nose. He was smelling the air. This was the moment on which everything turned. Not the silence, not the camouflage, not the patience or the training or the equipment modifications or the years of accumulated doctrine. The question of whether 5 men lived or died in that moment was being decided by the chemistry of the human body, by the specific molecular information contained in what the men lying in the undergrowth smelled like. An American patrol would have smelled of the things that American soldiers carried with them from their world into this one. The synthetic chemical sharpness of standard-issue soap that had no equivalent anywhere in the natural biology of a Vietnamese jungle, the toasted sweetness of American cigarettes, whose tobacco was processed differently from the harsh local varieties wrapped in banana leaves, the specific metabolic byproducts of a body fueled by processed food, red meat, white bread, and dairy products, a biochemical signature that produced sweat with a fundamentally different composition from a body fueled by rice and fish and local vegetables. These were not merely different smells. They were impossible smells, scents with no natural equivalent in the biology of this environment, some broadcasting a foreign presence to any nose trained by a lifetime of exposure to what the jungle actually smelled like. The 5 men in the undergrowth smelled of the jungle floor. They smelled of the rotting vegetation that covered every surface in the wet heat of the province. They smelled of fermented fish sauce, the condiment that local people used in cooking, that saturated the air of every settlement within miles, that was, to a Vietnamese nose, simply the smell of the ordinary world. They did not smell of soap. They did not smell of American tobacco. They did not smell of anything that did not belong. The scout breathed, found nothing in the air that triggered the alarm his training had prepared him to respond to, and moved on. He walked past them and did not return. He walked back into the jungle he knew and left 5 men lying in the undergrowth who were still breathing because they had understood something that the most expensive military in human history had not. That in a war fought by human senses in biological terrain, the human body itself was either a weapon or a liability, and the choice between those 2 outcomes was made not by generals, but by the specific things a soldier put on his skin in the morning. He would never know what he had failed to find. The intelligence the patrol had spent 6 days accumulating, the precise location of a supply network that had been operating for 3 years, the specific routes and timing of enemy movement through the sector, would make its way back to Nui Dat, or where it would direct operations that dismantled an infrastructure the enemy had believed was invisible. 8 days of nothing, no shots fired, no contact made, no trace left in a jungle that should have been watched, had produced an outcome that no amount of firepower had achieved in the same sector in the preceding 2 years. The crisis came on the 8th night, when the intelligence work was complete, and extraction was the only remaining task. The radio failed. The operator worked the connections with hands that he deliberately kept steady, cleaning corroded contacts with the blade of his knife, reconnecting power through the sequence the failure required. Around their position, the sounds of the jungle had changed in the particular way that meant something significant was moving nearby. More than one something. The patrol was not alone on that rise, and the distance between them and whatever was out there was decreasing. Then, through the static, the radio came back online. The transmission was short, grid reference, brevity code, request acknowledged, and the helicopters came, guided by a command aircraft whose pilot could see from altitude what the patrol on the ground could not. Flanking elements attempting to close from two directions simultaneously. The extraction was not leisurely. The helicopter came in low and fast. The patrol was aboard before full contact could be established, and the aircraft lifted away while the jungle below erupted in fire that arrived 11 seconds too late. When the helicopter touched down at Nui Dat, the intelligence the patrol carried was already being prepared for transmission to battalion command. A supply network that the Viet Cong had operated for 3 years in a sector they considered secure was about to cease to exist. That is what a footstep turned into a weapon looks like, not a shot. A step, placed 1 inch at a time, by men who had accepted that the jungle sets the terms and that the only way to operate inside it successfully was to stop fighting against it and start becoming part of it. In time, the enemy came to recognize the shape of what was being done to them. They recognized it the way prey recognizes a predator whose presence is felt before it is seen, not through analysis, but through the accumulated evidence of disappearances that had no explanation, of positions that were supposed to be safe, proving catastrophically not to be, of operations planned in conditions of apparent secrecy, somehow being anticipated and countered before they could be executed. The name they gave it spread through the province, the way all important information spreads among fighting men, through the specific, concrete testimony of those who had survived encounters, amplified by the imagination of those who had not. Ma Rung. In Vietnamese, phantoms of the jungle. In several communist military histories of the period, Australian Regular Infantry Battalion elements are referred to as Viet Cong, commandos, because the Australian infantry, which routinely operated in section and half-platoon patrols rather than the large formations Americans favored, presented an incomprehensible contrast to the forces the Viet Cong were accustomed to encountering. The SAS received a separate designation entirely. They were not commandos. They were something else, something that did not announce itself before it struck and did not leave recoverable traces after it was gone. The evidence of what that name cost survives in testimony that no official American account of the war has ever adequately reckoned with. A female former Viet Cong member, speaking on camera in a documentary produced in 2015, made a distinction that encapsulates the entire strategic reality of the Australian campaign in Phuoc Tuy Province. We were not afraid of the American GIS, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing, she said. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. She had survived the war. She had faced artillery, aerial bombardment, and every weapon the Allied forces could bring to bear across years of sustained conflict. None of it terrified her, the way 5 men moving without sound had terrified her. The fear wasn't of firepower. It was of something more fundamental and more destabilizing, the complete inability to know where the threat was until it had already struck. A former Viet Cong commander offered the analytical version of the same judgment. Worse than the Americans were the Australians, he said. The American style was to hit us, then call for planes and artillery. Our response was to break contact and disappear if we could. The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. He was describing, with the clarity that comes from having studied an enemy out of survival necessity, on the precise philosophical difference between the two approaches. Against the Americans, the tactical response was known and reliable. Absorb the initial contact, close the distance to neutralize the air support advantage, then disengage and dissolve back into the jungle. Against the Australians, there was no reliable response. You cannot close the distance with an enemy you cannot find. You cannot disengage from a predator who has been watching you from 30 meters away for 6 days and has chosen the moment of contact on its own terms. 580 Australian SAS soldiers served in Vietnam across the 5 years of the regiment's deployment. They conducted 1,175 patrols, not including 130 additional patrols by the attached New Zealand SAS. Against them, 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses: 1 killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 killed in accidents, 1 missing in action, 28 wounded in total. The regiment suffered more accidental deaths than deaths in direct combat with the enemy, a statistic that sounds impossible until you understand that it is the precise mathematical expression of what happens when 5 men moving in total silence through enemy territory are so difficult to locate that the primary danger they face is not enemy fire, but the operational hazards of extended operations in extreme terrain. Major Reginald Beasley, commanding 3 Squadron during one of its tours, and tore down the kill score boards that previous squadrons had erected in the unit area. Other squadrons had maintained these boards as a form of competitive pride, running tallies of enemy eliminated that could be compared between units and held up as evidence of effectiveness. Beasley removed them without ceremony. "We were not there to kill people," he said, "but to gain information." It was the most concentrated expression of the Australian philosophy ever committed to a direct verbal statement. The kills were a byproduct. The intelligence was the objective. The patience was the method. The footstep, placed 1 deliberate inch at a time through jungle that concealed an army, was the instrument of everything that followed. The cost of building this capability was paid by men and by dogs in a currency that the Army's official accounting never fully captured. Marcus's story, 5 handlers, 4 years, never coming home, represents the program's most sustained individual sacrifice. But the human texture of what the program demanded appears most vividly in the specific characters of the animals, whose personalities became as real to their handlers as those of any soldier who served alongside them. Caesar's handler Peter Horan described the dog as possessed of an irreverent intelligence that expressed itself in the field as something approaching tactical intuition, a quality that made the word larrikin seem almost insufficient. Caesar was the only one of the 11 to have his portrait painted by an official war artist. And Ken McFadden completed the work in 1968. The portrait was shipped back to Australia. Caesar was not. Tiber, who had been shell-shocked at Fire Support Base Coral in May of 1968, when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded a few feet from his position, who had bolted in terror across the battlefield that night, while a soldier gave chase and made what he later described as one of my less successful rugby tackles before giving up entirely and returning to his post, slunk back into Australian lines at 10 o'clock the following morning. He lay down on a soldier's boots, with his head turned away from the man's face, the posture of an animal that understood it had failed at the thing it existed to do. The soldier said, "I don't blame you for going over the hill, old boy." Tiber never worked effectively as a tracker again. He was retired and given to staff at the Australian Embassy in Saigon. Justin, the dog who had been formally charged with disorderly conduct and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline after biting another dog and destroying Army equipment, who had been sentenced to 2 weeks in his kennel on half rations in a proceeding that was simultaneously entirely serious and entirely absurd, had also located enemy forces during Operation Santa Fe and contributed directly to the intelligence that directed a successful engagement. In November of 1971, as Australian forces prepared to leave Vietnam for the last time, the quarantine regulations that governed the importation of animals into Australia were not waived for these 11 dogs, who had served 3 years in the most operationally demanding environment in the theater. the Army did not formally request a waiver. Justin went to a civilian household in Saigon. So did Caesar. So did Marcus. The memorial plaque that would eventually be erected for them carries words that describe their service in terms that no military citation written for human soldiers ever equaled. Down the jungle tracks, through shot and shell, ears pricked, keen sense of smell, our tracker dogs with care and poise, alert to ambush, foreign noise, never whimper, whine nor bark. Their service honored with this plaque, no medals pinned to hairy chest. They stayed behind. They were the best. All gave something. Some gave all, so not one of the 11 came home. It took Australia until 2017 to officially recognize their service with the K9 Operational Service Medal, 46 years after the last of them were left behind in Saigon. The Viet Cong had placed a bounty on tracker dogs and their handlers in 1967. In their own ruthless assessment of the battlefield, the enemy had understood what these animals were worth long before the institution that created them demonstrated that understanding through official recognition. The lesson these animals helped prove was buried almost as soon as it was demonstrated, and the burial was not accidental or the result of oversight. It was institutional, deliberate, and documented. In the archives of the United States Army, there are documents from the Vietnam War period with words crossed out in ink. The crossed-out words describe who trained American soldiers to track the enemy through the jungle. They describe the British Jungle Warfare School in Malaysia. They describe the instructors, British, New Zealand, and Australian, who spent 65 days transferring the accumulated knowledge of decades of jungle campaigns to American soldiers who had no equivalent experience. In the margins of these documents, someone has written a replacement for the crossed-out words. At Fort Gordon, Georgia, the United States Army had physically altered its own operational records to remove evidence that it had been taught by others. This is not interpretation or retrospective analysis. It is documented in archives obtained under Freedom of Information requests decades after the war ended. The Americans had decided to copy the Australians, and then they had decided to pretend they had invented what they were copying. The combat tracker program that resulted from this classified training was adopted by American units from 1967 onward, but adopted in the way that institutions adopt things they do not fully understand, correctly in form and incorrectly in application. Infantry commanders receiving tracker teams frequently misunderstood their operational purpose, using them as expendable point elements sent ahead of a larger formation rather than as precision intelligence systems that required their own operational logic and their own command relationships. I think it was just that a lot of companies and platoons had never heard of us, so they had no idea how we operated, said one American tracker veteran. The teams produced results despite the misapplication. The credit for those results went, almost invariably, to the infantry units they supported rather than to the trackers themselves. The program was discontinued in late 1971, the same year the Australians withdrew from Vietnam. The following year, the United States Army published Field Manual 742, Combat Tracker and Tracker Dog Training and Employment, a comprehensive manual documenting in careful detail a capability that the institution publishing it had just decided to stop maintaining. They had written the lesson down. Then they closed the book. What Westmoreland never publicly acknowledged, what the institution could not concede without admitting that its fundamental approach to the war had been wrong from the beginning, was what Phuoc Tuy Province looked like when the Australians left it. The territory that Westmoreland had declared was being managed too passively. The ground he had formerly complained was not being cleared quickly enough. Was by 1971 the only province in South Vietnam that could credibly claim to have been substantially cleared of Viet Cong main force units through sustained counterinsurgency operations. Highway 15, The main route running through the province between Saigon and Vung Tau was open to unescorted civilian traffic, not because of a decisive conventional battle, not because of overwhelming firepower applied to a defined enemy formation, because an enemy that required jungle anonymity to survive and operate had been systematically and patiently denied that anonymity by patrols that moved at 9 hours per mile and tracker dogs that cost $3. The lesson did not die when the program died, because lessons that are written in operational results, rather than in doctrine, are carried in the people who produced those results, and those people kept living after the program was disbanded. In 1977, Colonel Charles Beckwith, tasked with creating what would become Delta Force, the United States Army's first dedicated counterterrorism unit, began researching training methodologies for an organization that needed to be capable of things no existing American military formation could do. He found in the classified archives the reports documenting the Australian approach in Vietnam. He made contact with Canberra. Australian and New Zealand SAS veterans made their way to American training facilities and taught again what had been classified, altered, and buried: the patrol course. The SASR runs today connects directly to the curriculum that shaped the MACV Recondo School, which shaped the long-range reconnaissance patrol training that shaped the special operations doctrine of every NATO nation that operates in complex terrain. When elite operators move silently through hostile territory today, since they move in a lineage that runs back through Fort Gordon and the British Jungle Warfare School to a concept proven in a province 50 miles east of Saigon by men who moved at 3 kilometers per day and bought their most effective intelligence asset from a Sydney dog pound for $3. The tracking dog capability, meanwhile, was allowed to lapse in Australia and was never fully reconstituted in the decades that followed. In Iraq and Afghanistan, where the operational environment demanded exactly the capabilities that had been set aside a generation earlier, canine tracking teams were rebuilt from near scratch at considerable cost in time and lives that a maintained capability might have saved. The Labrador Retriever is still irreplaceable. The technology that was supposed to make it obsolete has not, or in 50 years of sustained development and investment, produced anything that can isolate a single human odor across many kilometers of difficult terrain and provide early warning when approaching the threat. The $3 dog from a Sydney death row has not been improved upon. Now, return to that afternoon in Phuoc Tuy Province, when a Viet Cong scout stopped and breathed the air above 5 motionless men and found nothing there that should not have been there. He was searching for a specific kind of presence, the foreign body, the chemical signature of the Western world arriving uninvited in a place it did not belong. He found none of it. He moved on. The province he was helping to defend, the stronghold that had sheltered hundreds of soldiers for decades and had defied every sensor and surveillance system deployed against it, was being quietly and systematically unmade by patrols that did not smell like armies, by dogs that did not bark, by footsteps placed with the specific care of men who had accepted what a far larger military refused to accept: that the jungle sets the terms, and that the only way to survive inside it was to stop fighting against it and start becoming part of it. 5 men, $3, 9 hours per mile, 10 days of silence. The Viet Cong called them phantoms. The historians largely ignored them. The institution that most needed to learn from them spent years crossing their name out of its own documents. And still, the lesson survives, because the truth about what works in a jungle does not care about the politics of who discovered it, or the pride of the institution that refuses to admit it learned from someone else. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is a simple one. If all of this was known by 1966, if the silence, the tracker dogs, the patience, the 9 hours per mile, If all of it was demonstrably working in the only province in South Vietnam that was actually held by the time the war ended, why did it take another generation to believe it? The answer is not a comfortable one, and it has not changed. If this story deserves to be told, leave a comment below. And if you want to know what other lessons the history books are still sitting on, the things that worked, that were proven, that were buried for reasons of institutional pride, the next one is already waiting.